The gavel struck like thunder, sharp and unforgiving, echoing through the chamber until every murmur fell silent. Judge Andrew Napolitano leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of authority sharpened by arrogance. With a tone more final than fair, he declared the fine against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't just a penalty, it was a public rebuke, a verdict designed to wound not only her reputation, but the very principles she carried into the room. Asterisk gasps rippled across the gallery. Reporters froze mid-scribble, cameras snapped with desperate urgency, and the entire chamber seemed to tighten in anticipation. Some sat back with a smirk, satisfied to see a woman of color and conviction scolded like a schoolchild. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to break the silence. And yet in that heavy moment, no one could look at Jasmine Crockett without wondering, would she bow or would she rise? Asterisk, the fine was stiff, almost theatrical, meant to send a message. Napolitano's eyes lingered on her, daring her to protest, to falter, to flinch. He had all the symbols of power on his side, the robe, the gavel, the elevated bench, but symbols can be deceptive. And beneath his show of dominance lingered the faintest trace of something else. Fear of a voice too powerful to suppress. Asterisk Crockett did not move at first. Her stillness was its own defiance, her silence more eloquent than any outburst. The chamber leaned in, restless, expecting either submission or fury. Instead, they saw the calm of someone who had been underestimated all her life, someone who had carried heavier burdens than a judge's scorn. Asterisk, the moment stretched until the air itself seemed to hold its breath. And then came the line, the words that would replay across millions of screens. The words that would ignite debates and flood social feeds, the moment Judge Napolitano's words left his mouth. No one expected what would come next. Asterisk, the crowd did not yet know it, but this was not the scene of a reprimand. This was the beginning of a reversal. Napolitano believed he had silenced her, but he had only set the stage. And as Jasmine Crockett finally lifted her gaze, steady and unyielding, the entire room braced for something they would not soon forget. Asterisk, long before Judge Napolitano raised his gavel, Jasmine Crockett's reputation preceded her. She was not a politician who measured her words for comfort. She spoke as though every syllable was a challenge, every sentence a shield for the people who had entrusted her with their hopes. In an era when too many chose silence for safety, Crockett made her name by standing loud, proud, and unapologetic. For progressives, for immigrants, for those who felt ignored in the corridors of power. She was more than a lawmaker, she was a voice. It was precisely that voice the fine now threatened to muzzle. Asterisk, the political climate was a storm in itself. Partisan lines had hardened into walls, every debate framed as existential, every ruling a battlefield. To silence a woman like Crockett in such a climate wasn't just procedural, it was symbolic. It whispered to her supporters, "Your defiance has a price." And to her critics, it signaled a victory, a chance to reduce her to a headline of humiliation. Asterisk, but here's where Napolitano's calculation began to falter. A fine might have been meant as a warning, a financial slap meant to sting and move on. Instead, it was interpreted as an act of suppression, a visible attempt to crush dissent in real time. Social media, always hungry for drama and justice in equal measure, caught the scent within minutes. Asterisk, clips of the gavel strike and Napolitano's decree spread like wildfire across Twitter and TikTok. One video caption read, "They really think they can silence Jasmine." Another simply said, "Watch her face. Something's coming." The hashtags began to swell. Hashtag stand with Crockett. Hashtag voice on trial. Hashtag Napolitano vs Crockett. To her supporters, the fine was never about dollars. It was about dignity. And in politics, dignity is currency far more valuable than money. Inside the chamber, even those who sat stone-faced could feel the stakes rising. Everyone knew Crockett was not the type. Twofold quietly, the judge's action had cornered her, but in doing so, it had also sharpened her resolve. You could see it in the way she straightened her shoulders, the subtle set of her jaw, the slow, deliberate way she prepared to respond. Asterisk, because this wasn't just about one woman facing one judge. This was a trial of representation itself. What happens when a system tries to put a price on dissent, when authority attempts to reduce conviction to a financial penalty? For Crockett, every immigrant who had worked too many jobs to be heard, every young activist told to wait their turn, every voter dismissed as insignificant, was watching through her. Asterisk, the tension was thick, yes, but so was the sense of inevitability. Audiences across the country knew it. The comment sections knew it. Even those in the chamber could sense it. The fine wasn't the end of the story. It was the spark. Asterisk, and so, as Crockett prepared to speak, the unspoken truth settled. Across the room, this confrontation had become larger than either of them. Judge Napolitano may have believed he was delivering a reprimand, but in reality, he had summoned a reckoning. Asterisk, because this wasn't just about a fine, this was about dignity on trial. Asterisk, to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding. One had to look at the man behind the gavel. Judge Andrew Napolitano was not a newcomer to controversy, nor a stranger to the spotlight. For decades, his reputation had been carefully sculpted, a libertarian firebrand, a commentator who styled himself as a champion of freedom and constitutional purity. To some, he was a principled scholar of law. To others, he was a performer in a robe, wielding eloquence not for truth, but for control. Asterisk, Napolitano's rise had been steeped in contradiction. He had built a career warning of government overreach, casting himself as the protector of liberties under siege, yet time and again his own actions blurred the line between defense of freedom and defense of power. On television, he spoke of restraint. In the courtroom, restraint was often the first casualty. He wore the title of judge-like armor, a shield against criticism. And with that armor came a certain arrogance, the belief that his authority was beyond reproach. Asterisk, this arrogance was not hidden. Colleagues whispered of his sharp tongue, his impatience with dissenting arguments, his tendency to treat challenges as insults rather than tests of truth. Those who admired him called it confidence. Those who knew better called it hubris. When that hubris met a woman like Jasmine Crockett, the collision was inevitable. Asterisk, on the surface, the fine against her was just another exercise of authority. But beneath it pulsed something more personal. Napolitano had never taken kindly to being challenged by figures who refused to bow to his intellect or his robe. Crockett, outspoken and unshaken, embodied everything he instinctively resisted. A new generation of leadership that would not ask permission, that refused to apologize for existing loudly in spaces once reserved for the powerful few. Asterisk, he had sparred with political figures before. He had won debate, delivered sound bites, and reveled in his reputation as the judge who never backed down. But Jasmine Crockett was different. She was not just a politician, she was a symbol. Her presence alone carried the weight of a community that had fought to be heard. In trying to diminish her, Napolitano was not merely confronting a woman, he was confronting a movement. Asterisk, and yet blinded by years of applause and his own cultivated myth, he miscalculated. He believed the fine would land as humiliation. He believed silence would follow. He believed, perhaps, that the public would nod along, chalking it up as just another politician put in their place. But arrogance is the enemy of foresight, and Napolitano had not anticipated the scale of resistance waiting outside his chamber walls. Asterisk, already. Critics were drawing lines between his words and the long legacy of power used to suppress inconvenient voices. Commentators asked, how could a man who prided himself on liberty justify silencing an elected representative with a penalty designed not for justice, but for spectacle? The contradiction was glaring, and the public was beginning to notice. Asterisk, still, in that chamber, Napolitano carried himself as though untouchable. His eyes swept the room with the calm authority of someone who believed history would side with him. But history has a cruel way of humbling those who cling too tightly to it. For in that very moment, unbeknownst to him, the tide was already shifting. Asterisk, because what he had cast as punishment was about to be transformed into opportunity. His attempt at control was about to unravel into exposure. The very fine he believed would reinforce his dominance was about to become the symbol of his undoing. Asterisk, the gavel had fallen. Yes, but it had not ended the debate. It only begun. The downfall. Asterisk, and as Jasmine Crockett sat across from him, her silence brimming with something stronger than fear. The truth was undeniable. In trying to humble her, Judge Napolitano had set the stage for his own humiliation. Asterisk, to grasp why this moment carried such electricity. You have to understand who Jasmine Crockett is, not just the title beside her name, but the journey carved into her voice. She was not born into privilege, nor did she inherit the velvet pathways that ease so many into politics. Her story was one of grit and grace, forged in the crucible of struggle. Every victory was hard-won, and every setback left scars that hardened into strength. Asterisk. Crockett's beginnings were humble, rooted in a community that knew the weight of neglect. She grew up surrounded by stories of neighbors working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, just to keep food on the table. She saw firsthand how promises made in marble halls rarely trickled down to cracked sidewalks. It was here that her sense of justice began to take root, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a lived necessity. For her, fairness was not a courtroom argument. It was survival. Asterisk, before she was ever a politician, she was a lawyer, and not the kind who padded resumes with corporate clients or high-paying firms. She chose the trenches. Criminal defense, civil rights, cases where the odds were stacked against people society preferred to forget. She defended protesters. She represented the poor. She took on clients who couldn't afford to pay, not because it was easy, but because it was right. In those crowded courtrooms, with judges who often looked at her the way Napolitano would one day look at her, she learned the power of refusing to shrink. Asterisk, her colleagues described her as fearless. Opponents called her reckless. But the truth lay somewhere in between. She had simply grown too accustomed to fighting battles others ran from. Every time she was underestimated, every time she was spoken over, every time she was told to wait her turn, she filed those moments away, not as wounds, but as fuel. Asterisk, when she ran for Congress, few believed she could win. Too bold, they said, to direct. Too unwilling to play the game by rules designed to keep outsiders on the margins. But her community believed in her. They saw themselves in her, loud, unpolished, unwilling to bow. And so she carried their voices with her to Washington. Voices that did not whisper politely but demanded to be heard. Asterisk, by the time she faced Napolitano, Crockett had already built a reputation on Capitol Hill as one of the most outspoken freshman members of Congress. She sparred with colleagues who underestimated her. She clashed with critics who tried to caricature her. She leaned into her identity unapologetically as a black woman, as a fighter, someone who knew her presence in those halls was not a favor granted but a right earned. Asterisk. And this is what made the find so significant. For Napolitano, it was a gavel strike, a procedural punishment. For Crockett, it was a reminder of every time authority had tried to press her voice into silence. It echoed every dismissal she had ever endured, every attempt to shame her into shrinking. But what those watching did not yet realize was that Crockett had been training her entire life for this exact moment. Asterisk, the chamber that day was filled with tension, but also with symbolism. On one side sat a judge draped in robes, buoyed by decades of power and a belief in his untouchability. On the other sat a congresswoman whose very existence in that chamber was an act of defiance against history. This was not just a clash of personalities, it was a collision of eras. The old guard's authority against the new guard's insistence on being heard. Asterisk, her supporters online knew it too. As clips of Napolitano's decree spread, so did reminders of Crockett's journey. Posts celebrated her as the people's fighter, a woman who's never backed down. Comment threads turned into testimony lines, with ordinary Americans sharing how her speeches had made them feel seen, how her story mirrored their own struggles. For them, this fine wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about anyone who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Asterisk, and Crockett understood that weight. She wore it like armor. The silence after Napolitano's gavel was not hesitation, it was strategy. She was deciding how best to remind the chamber and the world beyond it that fines could be levied. Titles could be flaunted, but truth could not be extinguished. Asterisk because Jasmine Crockett was not the kind of woman to crumble under pressure. She was the kind of woman who turned pressure into diamonds. And in that chamber, facing a judge who believed he had the final word, she was ready to prove it again. Asterisk, the stage was set. Her life had prepared her for this confrontation. And as she finally prepared to break her silence, it became clear too. Everyone watching, this was not just another heated exchange. This was about to become a defining moment. Asterisk, what Napolitano thought was a penalty would become the opening act of a transformation he could not control. The chamber braced. America watched. And Crockett drew in a steady breath. Asterisk. The next words out of her mouth would not simply defend her, they would ignite a storm. Asterisk, the silence shattered when Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward. Her voice, measured but charged with an electricity that snapped through the chamber. She did not raise her tone at first. Instead, she spoke with the kind of calm that unsettles more than anger ever could. Your Honor, she began, each syllable deliberate, this fine may carry a dollar amount, but let's be very clear, it carries a deeper message. The room stiffened, every ear straining, every camera locked. Asterisk Napolitano's eyes narrowed. He adjusted himself in the chair, draping authority across his words as he interrupted. Congresswoman, you are out of order. The gavel struck again, sharp and impatient, but this time it did not silence the murmurs. It only added fuel. Asterisk Crockett straightened, refusing to shrink beneath the sound. Out of order? She repeated, her gaze unwavering. I was elected to speak for people who have been out of order all their lives. Out of jobs, out of homes, out of patience with a system that never hears them. If my voice shakes this chamber, it's because this chamber needs shaking. Asterisk, the crowd gasped audibly, the kind of collective intake of breath that signaled something extraordinary was unfolding. A few aides whispered furiously into phones. Reporters typed without blinking, trying to capture every syllable before it slipped away. Napolitano's gavel thundered again, but the effect was different now. It sounded less like command and more like desperation. Asterisk, you will respect the authority of this court. Napolitano snapped, his voice rising, his composure thinning. He leaned forward, his face stern, the robe cloaking him in the shadow of institutional power. Your defiance only confirms why the fine was necessary. Asterisk, and there it was, the escalation. His attempt to press her down became the accelerant to her rise. Crockett leaned in as well, meeting him eye to eye. Respect is earned, Judge, not imposed. May fine me, but you will not silence me. Not today, not ever. Asterisk, the chamber trembled. With tension, supporters of Napolitano shook their heads in disbelief. Crockett's allies whispered encouragement under their breath. Every second stretched, heavy with anticipation, as though the very walls of the chamber were waiting for what would come next. Asterisk social media feeds lit up in real time, clips of the exchange already racing beyond the chamber. Commenters typed in all caps, "She's not backing down." And this is history. The battle unfolding inside that room was already being replayed in living rooms, classrooms, and coffee shops across the country. Asterisk Napolitano, visibly rattled, leaned back, his jaw tight. He attempted to reassert his dominance with a long pause, as if silence could reclaim his authority. But silence no longer belonged to him. Crockett had seized it. She filled it with the power of presence, the authority of resilience. Asterisk, and then came the turning moment. The chamber sensed it before it arrived. Crockett's expression sharpened, her voice dropped to a lower register that commanded attention. You think this fine is about me? No. This is about the message you send to every American who dares to stand up and speak truth to power. But let me tell you something, Judge. Power without justice is nothing but performance. And your gavel. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Cannot perform justice when it's wielded as a weapon. Asterisk, the gallery erupted, some with applause muffled into their palms, others with gasps that carried disbelief. Even those who opposed her could not deny the gravity of what she had just unleashed. Napolitano's robe, once a symbol of unquestioned command, now seemed heavy, almost fragile. Asterisk, the escalation had reached its peak. One side was rattled, clinging to titles and symbols. Others stood firm, rooted not in position but in conviction. The chamber knew a collision was inevitable. Asterisk. And as Crockett prepared to deliver the words that would push this confrontation from heated debate into unforgettable history, the room fell into a silence more deafening than any gavel strike. Asterisk. Because what came next would not just answer Napolitano's fine, it would redefine the entire balance of power in that room. Asterisk. The silence was thick enough to cut, a silence that carried not submission, but suspense. Every camera stayed locked, every pair of eyes glued to Jasmine Crockett as she rose, slowly, deliberately, her posture radiating a defiance to calm to be dismissed as rage. She placed her hands firmly on the table, drew a steady breath, and began. Asterisk, Judge Napolitano, you say I am out of order. You find me as if to make an example. But let's talk about what's really out of order here. Asterisk, the first sentence landed like a spark on dry wood. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. Napolitano leaned back, attempting to maintain a veneer of calm. But the tightening in his jaw betrayed the unease that had begun to settle into him. Asterisk Crockett's voice was steady, but each word carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the pomp of the chamber. Out of order is a system that silences women when we raise our voices against injustice. Out of order is telling immigrants they must work twice as hard to be considered half as worthy. Out of order is a courtroom that wields fines as muzzles, robes as armor, gavels as weapons. Asterisk, she let the words hang, let them sting. The gallery shifted, restless, like a collective heartbeat quickening. Someone in the back exhaled too loudly, the sound echoing in the hush. Asterisk, Napolitano cleared his throat. Duck. Congresswoman, this is not the place, asterisk. But Crockett cut him off without raising her volume, slicing through his interruption like glass. This is exactly the place. It's because this chamber is supposed to be where justice lives. And yet today, you've turned it into a stage where arrogance plays dress-up as authority. Asterisk, the room erupted, not in shouts, but in gasps, the sound of disbelief colliding with awe. Napolitano shifted in his seat, his composure slipping, his gavel resting unused as though even he knew it would no longer command silence. Asterisk Crockett took a step closer, her voice deepening, commanding. You find me because my words make you uncomfortable, but discomfort is the birthplace of change. You can find me today, you can find me tomorrow. You can find me every day until your gavel turns to dust, but what you cannot do is erase the truth. Asterisk, the chamber shook with the weight of her conviction. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards trying to capture the fire blazing from her speech. Every second became a headline, every sentence a rallying cry. Asterisk, then she pivoted, her tone softening for just a moment, enough to draw her listeners in. I did not come here for comfort. I did not run for office to keep quiet in the back of the room. I came here for the single mother who works nights and still can't afford childcare, for the young man told to go back where he came from, though his roots are deeper in this country than the very marble under our feet, for the grandmother whose vote has been diluted, dismissed, discounted. I came here because voices like theirs are never invited into chambers like this, lest someone like me brings them in. Asterisk, it was a turning point. No longer was this about her and the judge. It had expanded, ballooned into something larger. The people versus the system, dignity versus suppression. Napolitano sat frozen, his lips pressed tight, his authority wilting. Under the floodlight of her truth, Asterisk Crockett straightened, her voice returning to its full force. You wear your robe like a shield, Judge, but let's not pretend shields make you invincible. History does not remember who held the gavel. History remembers who spoke when it mattered most. Asterisk, the crowd gasped again. A spectator muttered, my God, barely above a whisper, but loud enough to be caught by microphones. Napolitano gripped the arms of his chair as though anchoring himself against the storm. Asterisk, and then, the final blow, the line that would etch itself into headlines. And hashtags alike, you may think you find me. But today, Judge Napolitano, it is you who is paying the price. Because every word I speak will outlast your gavel, your robe, and your attempt to silence me. And long after this moment fades, the people will remember. Dignity is not fined into silence, it is spoken into history. Asterisk, the chamber exploded. Applause broke out despite the rules, drowning the last syllable of her statement. Phones waved in the air, recording the scene that would ignite across every platform within minutes. Napolitano reached for his gavel, but his hand trembled just slightly, the subtle betrayal of a man who realized control had slipped through his fingers. He struck it once, twice, but the sound no longer commanded the room. Asterisk, because in that moment, the authority belonged not to the bench, but to the voice that had risen against it. Asterisk, the silence that followed was no longer his to claim, it was hers. It was the silence of awe, of recognition, of a shift in the balance of power. And as Crockett returned to her seat, unshaken, the weight of her words lingered like an echo too heavy to fade. Asterisk, Napolitano sat back, his expression a mask of defiance barely concealing the fracture beneath. He had set out to humble her, instead. He had unleashed her. Asterisk, and while the gavel's echo faded into memory, the reverberations of her counterattack were only beginning. Asterisk, because what came next would not be confined to this chamber. It would sweep across screens, spill into conversations, and spark a reckoning that no fine could contain. Asterisk, the echoes of Jasmine. Crockett's words had barely faded before the first clips began ricocheting across the internet. Within minutes, the chamber was no longer just a room filled with lawmakers and onlookers. It had become the epicenter of a digital earthquake. Phones buzzed, timelines flooded, and hashtags soared into trending territory. Hashtag Crockett vs Napolitano, hashtag mic drop moment, and hashtag voice on trial surged to the top of Twitter within the hour. Asterisk on TikTok. Users spliced Crockett's declaration, "Dignity is not fined into silence." It is spoken into history with pulsing music, flashing captions, and slow-motion replays. Within 2 hours, the clip had racked up millions of views. Instagram Reels carried side-by-side reactions, young activists cheering in their bedrooms, immigrants wiping tears, students throwing their fists into the air as if they had been in the chamber themselves. Asterisk, cable news scrambled to keep up. Networks looped the footage, analysts speaking with the breathless tone usually reserved for election nights. One commentator declared this wasn't just a rebuttal. This was a dismantling of authority live on camera. Another side, Napolitano miscalculated. He tried to make her small. Steady made her historic. Asterisk, the ripple effect spread. Beyond punditry, celebrities joined the chorus. Famous singer tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just bodied that courtroom. This is what leadership looks like." A Hollywood actor posted on Instagram, "Respect isn't handed down from a gavel, it's earned, and she just earned mine." Even politicians who had clashed with Crockett in the past took to the airwaves, some begrudgingly, to admit that her composure under fire had left an impression. Asterisk, meanwhile, Napolitano's defenders scrambled for footing. Some argued the fine was justified, that Crockett had crossed procedural lines. But their words sounded thin, brittle, drowned out by the tidal wave of digital applause. For every defense, there were 10 viral replies mocking the idea that dignity could be silenced by a dollar amount. One viral meme showed Napolitano holding a gavel photoshopped into a toy hammer, captioned, "When you try to silence Crockett but end up silencing yourself." Asterisk, inside Crockett's own community, the moment was felt more personally. Local newspapers in her district printed front-page headlines celebrating her defiance. Churches replayed her words during Sunday services, tying them to scripture about truth standing firm against oppression. Community centers held watch parties, cheering like fans at a championship game. For them, this was not politics. It was validation. Proof that one of their own could enter the lion's den and roar back. Asterisk, and Napolitano. His silence was louder than any defense. He issued no statement that night. The absence of his voice became its own headline. Judge goes quiet after Crockett's fiery rebuke. The man who had prided himself on eloquence and clarity suddenly seemed diminished. His authority cracked by a moment he could not undo. But the shockwaves weren't just emotional, it carried political weight. Fundraising emails flew out of Crockett's campaign within hours, quoting her speech line for line. Each one met with donations pouring in from across the country. Grassroots organizations seized the moment, branding T-shirts with her words, raising money for voter drives. In her honor, what began as a fine had become fuel for a movement. For Napolitano, however, the consequences were far less celebratory. Editorial boards questioned his judgment. Legal scholars debated whether his fine had overstepped the bounds of propriety. The very legacy he had hoped to fortify with an iron hand was now under scrutiny. His name tethered not to order and discipline, but to an unforgettable humiliation. And yet. The true measure of the shockwaves was not in the commentary, the memes, or the money. It was in the faces of ordinary Americans who watched the clip on their phones late that night. The immigrant father telling his daughter, "This is why we came here." The young black student texting his friends, "She looks like Meond. She didn't back down." The grandmother in a small town whispering to herself, "Finally, someone spoke for us." Because what had unfolded in that chamber was no longer confined to Crockett versus Napolitano. It had become a story about America itself, about who gets to speak, who gets silenced, and who refuses to bow when dignity is on trial. And as the hashtags trended, and the applause spread from living rooms to classrooms to workplaces, one truth became inescapable. This moment was bigger than a gavel strike. It was a turning point. It was far from over. For the next battle would not play out in the chamber, but in the hearts of those inspired by what they had just witnessed. When the dust finally settled, and the chamber emptied of its buzzing crowd and clicking cameras, what remained was not just the memory of a clash, but the undeniable clarity of a moral truth. Jasmine Crockett had stood before the weight of a system, for a man whose gavel was supposed to symbolize authority, and she had transformed that moment into something bigger than herself. Her words echoed in the silence afterward, replayed. Not just on phones and televisions, but in the minds of those who had long felt that dignity was negotiable in the halls of power. What she proved that day was radical in its simplicity. Dignity is not something that can be bought, fined, or stripped away by a title. Dignity is carried, protected, and spoken into existence by those who refuse to bow. Judge Napolitano had entered the confrontation believing that discipline and power were the same thing. To him, silencing was control. But Crockett showed the opposite, that true power lies in restraint, in courage, in refusing to let arrogance dictate the terms of the fight. In the arc of the day, Napolitano had been reduced from gavel-wielding authority to a symbol of brittle pride, while Crockett had risen from defendant of her own actions to defender of something far greater. The principle that no one is too small to speak the truth, and the lesson did not stay within that chamber. Across the country, her words became rallying cries. For every immigrant who had ever been told to keep their head down, for every activist dismissed as too loud, for every child taught that their background made them less American, Crockett's stand became a living rebuttal. She did not just argue with Napolitano, she reclaimed space for all who had been pushed to the margins. The moral was clear. Silence is not the price of dignity. In fact, silence is the weapon of those who fear it most. Speaking, even in the face of punishment, transforms shame into pride, and isolation into community. By the time the next morning's headlines rolled in, Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman who had clapped back at a judge. She was framed as something else entirely, a reminder that America is still capable of producing voices that refuse to yield. Some commentators reached for history, comparing her stance to iconic moments of defiance in civil rights movements. 2 courtroom speeches that became scripture in civic life. Others simply called it the moment dignity won. But the resonance was the same. She had turned an attempt to punish to a demonstration of principle. And for those who watched her, the takeaway was deeply personal. It wasn't just about one debate, one ruling, or one clash of personalities. It was about the larger fight between arrogance and truth, suppression and expression, fear and courage. Crockett embodied the side of that fight that people wanted to believe, in the side where conviction triumphs, where voices rise, where justice may stumble but does not fall. The image that lingered wasn't of Napolitano's gavel. It was of Crockett standing firm, unshaken, her words cutting through the stale air of intimidation like a blade of light. That is what people carried with them after the video stopped playing. That is what they shared, reposted, and whispered to themselves, a reminder that no matter how heavy the hand of authority, the voice of truth can still ring louder. And in the end, the moral was less about Napolitano's miscalculation and more about Crockett's resolve, because one figure sought control and the other offered courage. One leaned on a gavel and the other leaned on history. One faded into silence and the other carved her voice into memory. That day. Dignity did not just survive, triumphed. And America, divided and weary though it may be, was reminded of something essential, that in the long war between arrogance and truth, it is always the voice of dignity that endures. And so, what began as a simple fine became something unforgettable. Reminder that when arrogance tries to bury dignity, it only plants the seed of resistance. Judge Napolitano thought he was delivering punishment. What he delivered instead was a platform. A moment that turned Jasmine Crockett into a symbol of resilience for millions who have felt dismissed, belittled, or silenced. This was never just about courtroom procedure or congressional decorum. It was about a larger fight: who gets to define America, whose voices matter, and whether fear can ever win over truth. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She defended every American who has ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, or know their place. And that is why this moment resonates far beyond the walls of that chamber. Because every time arrogance swings a gavel, there must be someone brave enough to answer it with words that outlast the echo. Crockett was that person. She reminded us that true authority does not come from robes, gavels, or fines. It comes from the courage to stand, to speak, and to fight for justice when silence would be easier. So as you finish this video, ask yourself, whose side are you on? The side that hides behind symbols of power, or the side that carries power in its voice, its dignity, its truth? If you believe in what Jasmine Crockett stood for, if you believe in an America where dignity cannot be fined or silenced, then don't let this moment pass. Share this story. Keep the conversation alive, because silence may be their weapon, but our voice will always be louder. Subscribe, stand with us, and let's make sure dignity wins again. And again and again.